All right, so we've got a lot to get through today here. I want to make sure we have time for it. So the first thing I'll kind of mention, I had this kind of office hours thing. I updated it. I thought that there was going to be CL sessions that weren't available tonight, but I found one of the leaders who was willing to take on additional sections, so they're back on. So the only CL session that won't occur tonight will be at 7:40 to 8:30 in Ballantyne 203. The other locations that I previously mentioned that won't be available are back on. All right, so that's only just one specific time and one location that aren't available. So technically, there's still 8 of the 9 that will be available tonight. All right, so you can kind of disregard that last announcement. I edited it, so there's only one time location that's not available tonight, and it's here in that announcement. Should be the first announcement on Canvas. Okay. Also, as a reminder, I have additional office hours if you are still around tomorrow. From 9 to 12, I'll be in my office in the morning if you want to stop by. The only other thing I wanted to mention is what's due at the end of the day tomorrow. That second Canvas discussion, which hopefully should be pretty easy points. I mentioned last week, but this is just an initial response to my post that is well thought out. Then that's 5 points. Another 5 points for accessing that BLS data, mentioning one of the tables that you're using, use some statistics for it that kind of go along with whatever your response is, at least part of that response, and then an additional 5 points each for 2 responses to other students. So if I'm looking at this, there's still a lot of people who need to get on and do this, but there are plenty of kind of posts that you can get on and respond to if you want to kind of complete that by replying to other students. So that is due at the end of the day tomorrow. These are easy points. If it were me, I would have gotten this done right away. But kind of open until the end of the day tomorrow, okay? Other than that, I don't think we'll have time in class today based off of the first class, although we ran into a hiccup at the beginning where I'm not exaggerating. It might have been 85 to 90 degrees in this room. It's now quite a bit cooler, which is nice. But if I don't have time to get through it, I'll likely be posting, even if we do get through it, I'll post like a 5 to 10 minute video that's talking about negative externalities in a slightly different way, visualizing them along with numbers that hopefully will help with a common misunderstanding or difficult part of negative externalities that I'm seeing pop up with a lot of questions. So additional kind of explanation video, you might see that pop up on the YouTube page. That might be I say might be. It's not required. Anything that we've kind of covered in class will be enough, but it might help with your understanding of negative externalities and just externalities as a whole, okay? I don't have to do that, but I think it would be worthwhile and valuable for you guys to have kind of a different, maybe a little bit more complicated way of looking at it, but it just might help it click for a lot of you, okay? All right. So other than that, we're kind of back to old hat. So after class, you'll have the next module 8 reading, module 7 quiz. Those are both still due at the end of the day on Monday, okay? Other than that, any questions for me before we jump into material here today? Okay, so I've got this slide. I'm going to actually skip it and just build it out for us today and point out some things that it doesn't have that I think will be helpful. Leading us in, revisiting at the very end of the last class, we started to talk about positive externalities, okay? So we said a negative externality is when there's an additional cost to people outside the market. Positive externality, there's an additional or an external benefit. So at the very end of class, we will look at a different way of modeling it just for the sake of me showing it to you. I am only going to expect you to model negative and positive externalities in one way for this class. It is a lot more intuitive when we start to calculate things like dead weight loss. And so this is the way that I want you to model it. Negative externalities were additional costs. So we always model them through what represents costs? Supply curve. Positive externalities are additional benefits. So we always model those through our demand curve. That'll just help with our interpretation of thinking about surplus, dead weight loss, etc. So if I've got my private marginal costs and my private marginal benefits, if I don't have any additional costs, society's marginal costs are the same as whatever the supplier's costs are. But if I have positive externalities or additional benefits, my marginal social benefit will be whatever the marginal benefit was to consumers plus my per unit valuation of that positive externality or my external benefit. So when I'm thinking about where would my marginal social benefit be, at every quantity, it will be whatever the private marginal benefit was plus the external benefit, right? So I was only ever giving you examples with kind of these nice linear shifts so we could think about this, right? So this, unlike taxes and subsidies, we're not saying where was the market before and after. The market is where it's at. It hasn't changed, right? So the market quantity and price will simply, we're going back to like module 3 even. The market quantity will simply be where supply is equal to demand, or the private marginal benefits are equal to the private marginal costs. And the price that the market kind of arrives at would be there. It's just, looks like that equilibrium price quantity. Now we're kind of overlaying on top of that market and say, okay, here's the market for this good, right? This is the equilibrium it arrives at. Where would the equilibrium be at if we looked at society's market for this good? Well, society would make the decision based off of their marginal benefits and marginal costs. So where would the marginal social benefit be equal to the marginal social cost? Out here, right? So society actually wants a quantity that's higher than what the market chooses, right? Because the market's not factoring in these additional benefits. So the market is doing what? Over or under producing? Well, if it's at a lower quantity, the market is actually underproducing from where society wants it to be. Right? Now, this is where it matters that you're modeling your positive externalities through the demand curve. Because if I start to ask you things about like the socially efficient price, what would the socially efficient price be, or where would the value be where marginal social benefit is equal to marginal social cost? That'd be somewhere up here. Okay. So what I can think about is, because the market is underproducing, every single unit in this range, we're not seeing these sold. Now, if they would have been, if the market would have went to that socially efficient quantity, what would the total surplus kind of be for society? It would be the difference between society's marginal benefits and society's marginal costs. So for every unit in this range, what would the total surplus have been if we could get to that socially efficient quantity? Well, the difference between my marginal social benefit and cost would be here. So for every unit that the market underproduced by, we're missing out on surplus that would have existed to society, right? Now, the market surplus is simply the area between supply and demand. It hasn't changed at all, right? The market is what it is. We're just saying if the market arrives at this point, relative to the efficient point for society, what would the loss of surplus be to society? It's not a loss in the market, it's a loss to society, right? So when we're talking about society, we don't use the private marginal benefits and costs, we use society's marginal benefits and costs, okay? So the market stops at a quantity that's too low, so all the positive surplus that would have existed in society from these units is not realized, okay? Any questions on this graph? This is kind of where we ended with positive externalities last class. Okay. So if I think about this in a slightly different way, and here I would maybe ignore this slide. I think I've got more things on what I just drew for you that's probably a little more productive. But let's say instead I look at it this way. And I want to think about the surplus that exists for society, but where is it kind of coming from? So when I have society, who am I factoring in? The producers and consumers in the market, but also the people outside the market that are impacted by whatever type of externality we're looking at. So the market itself is going to be where? Supply is equal to demand. So I'll come back to that in a second. What would producer and consumer surplus be if the market chooses the quantity? Well, they're going to choose this lower quantity of like about 55, it looks like here. It's just calculating very easy consumer producer surplus like back at module 5, the beginning of last week. No taxes, no subsidies, nothing. Just what is producer and consumer surplus if the market's at equilibrium? Okay. Now, we know that if the market stops here, what would the total benefit be to society? So remember, now we have positive externalities. So if I have the per unit value of the positive externality or the external benefit, that's the difference between? I had it written down here, but why am I drawing a different curve here? What's the difference between the demand curve and my society's marginal benefit? The external benefit. So if I look vertically, the difference between these two curves, the demand curve and the marginal social benefit, that difference is simply my external benefit per unit. So if I take that and I multiply it by the number of units the market is stopping at, that would represent the total positive externality, or the total benefit to society, right? The difference between these curves is the per unit. So if I want the total benefit, I take the per unit benefit times the number of units. That would be represented by this kind of parallelogram, right? Or like if you think about the shape of a rectangular parallelogram, we would just kind of find base times height here. Okay? So what is the total surplus to society if we are at the market quantity? Well, we would have producer plus consumer surplus now plus the total value of that positive externality represented by this red area. So here's my total surplus, right? But what did we say is our deadweight loss? Well, where would society want this quantity to be? Where the marginal social benefit is, so the market is actually underproducing. If we were at that efficient point for society, all of this would have been society's surplus. So we're missing out on that. So that represents our deadweight loss, right? So the total surplus at the market quantity is simply this area here, right? Consumer plus producer surplus plus the total value of that external benefit or the social benefit. So what are we missing out on? The surplus from those units that aren't being produced. So if this is the total surplus from the market quantity, what would total surplus be if we were at that socially efficient quantity? So if I'm at the efficient point for society, all I'd be looking at for total surplus is the difference between the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost curve, right? So here, if I'm looking back, where would my total surplus be for the market if I was at that socially efficient quantity? It would simply be the area in between my marginal social benefit and my marginal social cost curve. Remember, when we were finding total surplus for the market, we didn't care if it came from producers or consumers. It was just the area between supply and demand. That's because it was the area in between the private marginal benefits and the private marginal costs. When I want society's total surplus, it's the difference between society's marginal benefits and society's marginal costs. So if we were at that socially efficient quantity, it would be this entire triangle. So at the efficient point for society, all of this would be total surplus. If we allowed the market to choose, this is the total value of our social surplus. So it went down by this little amount here, which if that's the amount of surplus we were seeing society's total surplus go down by, that would represent society's deadweight loss. Now, this isn't deadweight loss in the market. Notice, when the market chooses the quantity, what's true about producer and what's true about deadweight loss in the market? We're at that point for the market. No, there's no deadweight loss. Right? The market doesn't experience any deadweight loss. But when we're talking about society, they're the one who is going to experience this deadweight loss. Okay? The producers and consumers aren't hurt in the market. Who is hurt by the fact that we have this positive externality exist and the producers or consumers aren't taking it into consideration? The deadweight loss is actually going to come from social total surplus. Okay? So I get that's a little bit different than how we were looking at it last week, because last week we were only focusing on the market. Now we're comparing the market to kind of society, right? Where society's total surplus values are. Any questions on anything kind of going on here? Okay. So what did we say we could do, right? And I kind of jumped the gun last class a little bit, so I'm going to fly through some slides because we've already covered a few of this. But when I had a negative externality, right, Well, we'll start since we're talking about positive externalities with those. Right? If I've got this positive externality, I said I can first start out, where's the market going to be, right? Where supply is equal to demand. If I've got positive externalities, I said there's additional benefits. So the benefit to society will be the private marginal benefits plus the per unit value of that positive externality. So society, if there's no negative externalities, the private marginal costs will be the same as society's marginal costs. Right? So where's the socially efficient point? Where marginal social benefit is equal to marginal social cost. So the market was underproducing. So if we want to get to that socially efficient quantity, what's a tool that we had to get to a higher quantity? I could give subsidies. Right? Now, I could model this technically as subsidies to producers or consumers. Last week, we talked about if I model taxes or subsidies, it doesn't matter who I give them to, I get the same result. So I'll just think about it as though I gave the subsidy to the consumer because I think it helps connect the dots between if I have a positive externality, why do I want to use subsidies and why would they fix my problem? If I give a subsidy to consumers, what happens to my demand curve? So if I give consumers money, are they going to want to do more or less of it? So my demand curve will increase, right? So if I can increase my demand curve so that my demand curve plus the subsidy matches up with society's marginal benefits, or we said another way of thinking about the marginal social benefit, it's almost like it's the demand curve for society. So if I can get the demand curve plus a subsidy to match up with society's demand curve, now what decision will consumers and producers in that market make? They'll actually be out here at that higher quantity. Right? So if I can shift the demand curve, now I can change the market so that the market makes a decision that's not underproducing, but actually out here at that socially efficient quantity. Now, what would the ideal value of that subsidy be? How could I get it to perfectly match society's demand curve or the marginal social benefit? Set it equal to what? Yeah, what's the difference between my demand curve and my marginal social benefit? That difference is simply that per unit value of the positive externality, or what we were calling the external benefit. Okay. Same kind of idea, right? If I have positive externalities, I can use subsidies here. If I have negative externalities, that's going to look like what? Well, I said to kind of keep it easier and consistent with how we're working through these, I can identify the market equilibrium where supply is equal to demand. But if I have negative externalities, that's additional what? Costs or benefits? Negative is cost, right? So my marginal social cost will be whatever the marginal costs of my producers were, plus whatever the additional cost to society was. So at every point, my social cost curve, or we said we could think about this as society's supply curve, would be up here. So we said with negative externalities, society wants the quantity to actually be lower. Right? We talked about multiple tools, but if I'm just thinking about tools that will eventually start to discuss how it internalizes costs or benefits, if I give a subsidy to increase quantity, what's something I could give to producers that would decrease quantity? And I'd not give them to them, but I would impose a tax on them, right? So I shouldn't have said that, a little bit differently. What would that do? Taxes on producers would decrease my supply curve. If I wanted to get that supply curve with the tax to exactly match my society's marginal costs, what's the optimal value of the tax? Well, what's the difference between my marginal social cost and my marginal cost? Simply the per unit value of that negative externality or my external cost. Okay? So you can model this and like, instead of taxing producers here to solve the negative externality issue, I could technically tax consumers. You'd end up finding the exact same result, that the tax would lower the quantity. I just think it's easier to connect the dots thinking about, oh yeah, taxes on producers, shift that supply curve to the left so that it would exactly match up with my society's marginal costs. Okay. And then subsidies, how can I get the demand curve to exactly match up with the marginal social benefit with positive externalities? I'd want to shift it by giving consumers a subsidy. Any questions on either of these? Now, I drew it out last class for you, but what's technically another way I could solve the negative externality issue? If I want to lower quantity, price ceilings, price floors, or quotas, right? All of them could help me get down to that lower socially efficient quantity, in which case I would eliminate the deadweight loss that existed to society, right? Any other questions there before we keep moving? Okay. So we're talking about corrective taxes and subsidies. I just drew these out for us. But the idea if I had like the perfect tax or the perfect subsidy, and I'm not even sure this shows up anywhere in the slides or the book, usually like we call a Pagovian tax, that would be the tax that's exactly equal to the negative externality, whereas like a Pagovian subsidy would be a subsidy that's exactly equal to the external benefit, right? That we're getting this tax or subsidy to get the supplier demand curve to perfectly match up with either society's marginal cost or social benefit, depending on what type of externality we're looking at, okay? Excuse me. So I already, alluded to, we could use quotas, right? So if I had like a command and control economy, I could just, if I'm a dictator, if I have a negative externality, what could I tell companies? You can only produce this much. If I had a positive externality, I could force them to produce more, right? Now, generally, we don't see that existing in more market-based economies. So our market-based policies, what their goal is not to try to accurately like identify the quantities and where the prices should be in the market, because there's a lot of other factors going on. But if we can come up with these groups that estimate the cost of pollution and then look at a per unit basis, well, now if I know the per unit cost of pollution, I can just use a tax to get either the producers or consumers to what we call internalize that negative externality. Because now they have to pay a tax. Before, they were ignoring the fact that their behavior was causing a cost to someone else. Once I tax them, they now start to make decisions as though that cost is their own, right? So I can make them internalize that additional cost by the use of a corrective tax. Similar idea, if there's additional benefits, I can get them to start to make decisions factoring in these additional benefits. Now, I don't think we'll kind of touch on this. I don't think we'll have time. But the idea is like you could also give tradable pollution permits where you have to pay for the rights to pollute. And then companies that have a lower cost to pollute, they are going to be less likely to buy these permits. They'll just eliminate their pollution. Whereas companies that have really high costs, they're going to buy these permits, the rights to just continue to operate as they are and just cause this pollution, right? Well, we won't dive into that. I don't think we'll have time. So for us, what we really just want to focus on, the market-based policies for this class would be taxes or subsidies, okay? So, this is just the idea. We make them internalize that, right? So we get to the private marginal cost, start to match up with society's marginal cost if we use taxes. If we use subsidies, we can get either the producers or consumers' marginal benefits to exactly line up with society's marginal benefits. Right? So going through these kind of quick, because this is more of like summary, and we've already kind of built out the models to answer this stuff. We talked about corrective taxes, subsidies, quotas. I didn't even have a slide in because we did price ceilings and price floors last class as well. Okay. All right, so we're now going to have the positive negative externality problem, ways market-based solutions using taxes or subsidies to solve it, okay? We're now going to dive into a little bit different train of thought, but we're going to talk about something called the Coase's theorem, or Coase's theorem. And what it really says is, it doesn't matter if we have these negative and positive externalities exist, as long as we give the people in our society the ability to bargain with each other, we're going to end up seeing that the private solution that the market chooses will actually end up being the same as what is socially efficient, okay? So it's kind of hard to think about. We'll put it more in a market-based context when I'm done, but I'm going to do a more simple, kind of easy example here first, okay? So let's say I've got this, I read this book to my son, Dick, the owner of a dog named Spot, right? So Dick owns this dog. It barks a lot, which causes a huge negative externality to his neighbor. So we got a two-person society, making it nice and easy, right? And the socially efficient outcome would be what maximizes surplus total for these two individuals, okay? So Coase's theorem says it doesn't matter who has the right to decide if this dog stays or goes, we still end up with the same outcome. So we'll think about case one. Let's say Dick values owning his dog Spot, that's $500. So Dick would be willing to pay up to what amount to keep the dog? $500. Jane hates the dog barking. The cost to her life is $800. What would she pay up to eliminate that cost? Up to $800. If she paid $500 and got rid of the dog, she'd actually be better off by $300. So with these values, let's say the owner of the dog, Dick, has the right to decide if the dog stays or goes. Well, if he's just making the decision on his own, does he want the dog to stay or not? The marginal benefit is $500. If he gets rid of the dog, his marginal benefit is $0, so it stays, right? But if we allow these people to bargain, what would Jane be willing to offer him? Up to $800. So let's just say she goes over and says, I'll give you $600 to get rid of the dog. Is she better off if that offer is accepted? Yes, right? Her cost of $600 will be lower than $800 if it stayed. Dick, he gets $600, but he'd lose a marginal benefit of $500. What's his kind of net gain? Is he better off? Technically, yes. Right? He's a bad dog owner, but yes, he's better off, right? So anytime there's this range of values in the middle where both people would be better off, we know they can come to some agreement where this dog is going to go away. Now, if I think about that's the private out, what would the social, if I could just come in as a dictator here and say, what's the total surplus for society if the dog stays? Well, if the cost of the neighbor is $800, the benefit is $500. Total surplus to society, if it stays, would be negative $300. What if the dog goes away? Well, if it just goes away, are there any benefits or any costs? So we're at 0. So what's the socially efficient outcome? For the dog to go away, right? So if I was a dictator, I'd say the dog goes. But even if I allow, I'm not, and I allow these people to bargain, we said there's going to be a range of values where we still see the dog goes away. We could choose 600 as one of those possible values. Okay? So as long as we allow the people in society to bargain back and forth, we still end up seeing that the private citizens end up making the same decision that a dictator would make for society's total well-being. Okay? Now, what if we had the exact same setup, but Jane has the right? Well, if Jane is just going to make the decision, does the dog stay or go? If it's only up to her, does she have any marginal benefit of the dog staying? No. She only has a cost. So what is she going to want to decide to do? Get rid of the dog. However, we know that Dick wants to keep the dog, but what amount would be he willing to go over the fence and offer her to keep it? If she accepts, is she better or worse off than if the dog goes? Well, she gets $500, but the dog stays. The cost is still $800. Her total surplus would be negative $300, whereas if the dog goes, her surplus is just 0. 0 is better than negative $300. There's no offer that Dick could make where she tells him he can keep the dog. So what do we end up with? The exact same outcome, right? The dog goes away. There's no amount of money that Dick could offer that she decides to let the dog stay. It didn't matter who had the right to decide. We still end up seeing that the socially efficient outcome, which was for the dog to go, ends up being the private outcome if we allow these people to bargain back and forth. Okay? Now, slightly different setup. Let's say we change the numbers a little bit. And now Dick is a better dog owner and values having the dog at $1,000, whereas Jane still has this same cost. Well, if Dick has the right to keep the dog, is there any amount of money that Jane would, well, first of all, if Jane has the right, kind of as before, it doesn't matter, is the dog going to stay or go? If she's just making the decision, we don't allow them to bargain, she says the dog's going to leave, right? But if we allow them to bargain, right? Or sorry, before I say that, if I was a dictator, what would I choose as optimal for society now? If the dog stays, the total surplus is what? 200. If it goes, the total surplus is 0. So 200 is better than 0. Now, if I allow my citizens to actually make the decision, what amount of money would Jane be willing to offer Dick to get rid of the dog? Up to 800. But if he accepts that, is he better off? No, because now if he gets rid of the dog, he got $800, but he lost the value of 1,000, he'd be at negative 200. Whereas if the dog stays, he's got 1,000 margin. So the dog stays, right? So in this case, it doesn't matter who kind of has the right. If the person who values it higher, right, there's no range of values here where they can come to an agreement, the socially efficient outcome ends up being the same as the private kind of decision made by our citizens, right? So this is a very non-technical, kind of non-market-based example of it doesn't matter who has the rights, as long as we allow people to trade or bargain back and forth, we'll end up at that socially efficient quantity. Now, why can this maybe break down? So if I think about this more in the context of a market, let's say there's a huge cost of pollution for society, right? Well, actually, I'll do the reverse. It's easier to think about. Let's say whatever good we're looking at causes a small amount of pollution. So the cost to society is relatively small. But producer surplus, which might be causing this pollution, is millions of dollars, right? So if I'm profiting by a lot, would I be willing to pay a little bit of money to the people in society in order to continue to pollute the same amount? Well, if the profits are greater than what the loss of society is, then yes, there's going to be a range where we can agree I'll pay off for the rights to pollute. And usually this looks like companies would pay the government for the right to pollute, right? We allow the government to kind of bargain on our behalves, right? So why might this break down? Well, if there's really high transaction costs, like let's say there isn't a huge discrepancy, like even in our example, if we had two neighbors trying to decide if the dog stays or goes, well, there was like only a range of like 300 or 200 in there that we could kind of come to an agreement on. But what if we have to pay lawyers a couple $1,000s? Well, now the costs are going to be high just to make this bargaining. It's not going to happen, right? So transaction costs, stubbornness. If you know that person who always has to be right, technically, what is the marginal benefit to them having their way? It's always going to be really high. Or if it's someone who always has to be right, the marginal benefit of getting what they want would actually be infinite. Is there anything I could ever offer them to make them change their decision? No, right? So transaction costs, stubbornness, and then if we don't have a simple two-person example, how can I get markets of millions of people in a society and thousands of companies to actually sit down and have representatives to like come up with some? It's hard. We have coordination problems the more people we have in our society. So this is something I'd less likely to kind of quiz or pop it on an exam, but there are reasons why that Coase theorem could break down. So kind of got a summary here of negative, positive externalities if you're kind of looking through it. Just, I gave some examples to think about that maybe I haven't mentioned here. We won't focus too much on this slide. It's more of like a slide for you to be able to go back to and kind of have a quick summary of negative, positive externalities. We said for negative externalities, it causes additional costs, and we can fix it by taxing. And we didn't talk about capping and trading, but that's the idea of kind of imposing quotas. We had positive externalities. We said the solution was, well, there's additional benefits. So how can I get there to be more of this good? The use of subsidies. Okay. So we'll kind of revisit this in the next thing that we talk about, but this is kind of our summary of what we've done with taxes and subsidies. So the next topic we're going to look at are different types of goods, right? We'll connect this to our positive externalities in a second, but for now, let's just think about there's different types of goods. So usually the types of goods we talk about up to this point in the semester are what we call private goods, right? These are goods that you go to the store and buy, and once you buy it, you own them, right? There are other types of goods that nobody technically owns, right? And that you don't have to pay to use. So I always use the example of national defense here. You can use state parks, or I'll give you a couple more examples here in a second. But national defense, the fact that it exists directly right now sitting here, like if you weren't a US citizen, even then, technically, are you paying for it? No, it exists, right? You're here, right? National defense exists, but you're not paying for the fact that it exists. You being in the United States, do you benefit from the fact that there is national defense? Yes. So we would say the fact that you're not paying for it is what we say makes that good non-excludable, right? You, in order to kind of enjoy the benefit of it, don't have to pay for it. Now, when you go to the store and you want to buy a laptop, right, or a phone, whatever, that would be excludable because you can't just take it and leave, right? You have to pay for it, making that good excludable. In order to own the right, in order to enjoy the marginal benefit, you have to buy it. So that's the idea of being excludable versus non-excludable. Now, these public goods, once it's out there, is you enjoying the benefit of national defense. At the same time, you get to enjoy the benefit as well. And you get to enjoy the benefit. So you getting a marginal benefit from this good, is it preventing anyone else from also getting a marginal benefit of that good being out there? No, we would say that makes the good non-rival. Most goods you think about, we would say are rival instead, right? When I buy this phone, can anybody buy this same physical phone? They can buy the same version, but can they have my phone? No, right? It's rival. Once I bought this, there's one fewer phones out there, iPhones out there for someone to buy, okay? So we'll start to think about these traits of excludable versus non-excludable. The easiest way to think about excludable is, do you have to pay directly to use that good, right? If you do, it's excludable. If you don't, it's non-excludable, right? So excludable means there's a price. Non-excludable, essentially, it's free, if we want to think about it that way. Now, the other trait I mentioned was, is it rival or non-rival? Rival means you using it could prevent someone else from using that good, or it means there's one fewer of that good for other people to buy. Non-rival means that if I'm enjoying this good and getting marginal benefit, it doesn't limit the amount that's available for everybody else. So this might be kind of weird initially. I'll get to kind of some examples. I said iTunes Music here. I'm like dating. I don't even know how much people use this, right? But like Spotify, you like, right? I don't know. Instead of iTunes, I'll give you a better example of a non-rival good. If you didn't live in the dorms and you lived off campus, you'd have to pay for internet or cable or electric service. Well, is it excludable or non-excludable? Can you use the electric in an apartment if you don't pay for it? No, so it's excludable. But is it rival or non-rival? You having electric from the electric company, does it prevent your neighbor from also having it? No, so it is non-rival, right? So we do have goods that show up that are non-rival, where you buying it or using it doesn't prevent the amount that's available for everybody else, okay? So those are our two traits. We have 4 different combinations of those. The easiest one is the goods we usually think about, which are private goods. There's something you have to pay for, and once I buy the rights to it, no one else gets to buy this exact unit. If I buy my car, I had to pay for it, it's excludable, it's rival, and that nobody can now buy that car, it's off the market, right? So these are most goods are going to be excludable and rival, or what we call private goods. Public goods, I already went through, I said, they're the exact opposite. You don't have to pay for them, they're non-excludable. So if I'm like a boat on the ocean, I grew up near Lake Michigan, a lighthouse, when I'm out, do I have to pay to enjoy using the light of that lighthouse? No, it's non-excludable. Is it non-rival? Well, yeah, me using that light doesn't prevent every other boat on the lake or the ocean from also using it, so it would be non-rival. Those are our public goods. Okay? Now, the other combinations, we won't really focus on natural monopolies yet. We have a whole chapter on monopolies later on, but natural monopolies are going to be like my examples of like cable internet, where they are both excludable, you have to pay for them, but many people, like me using it, doesn't prevent how much is out there for everyone else, so it's going to be non-rival. Now, the other one that we will focus a little bit on here today are going to be common resources. I always use like fish in the ocean, or if you want to think about deer that exists, like if we didn't have the market actually, I don't know, the government didn't get involved, you could technically go out and hunt or fish whatever you want. It would be non-excludable. Those animals just exist, right? But when you hunt and kill a deer, can anybody hunt and kill that same deer? It's gone, right? So it's non-excludable, but it would be rival. Those would be examples of common resources. And they're labeled as such because most of our examples are like fish in the ocean, deer that are out there. I'll use an example later on, publicly available lands to graze, things like that, okay? So we've got our 4 types of goods, and we want to think about these 2 traits and how they would change what type of good we have, and eventually what type of externality might exist because of that. So I'm going to use the same good here and run through some examples where it's the same good, but its traits will change what type of good it is. So if I want to use a toll road, I have to do what? Pay money to get on it. So a toll road is going to be what? Excludable. And a non-toll road would be, well, I can just go hop on, 45 or whatever it is, the highway up there. It's non-toll road. It's non-excludable. Now, I use this word congested. I can think about a road with heavy traffic versus not, right? Congested or heavy traffic is if I'm trying to get on the interstate and it's so backed up that it prevents me from getting on, what has that made that good? Well, if other people using it is preventing me from using it, it would be rival. Whereas if it's an uncongested road, there's no traffic, me getting on the interstate wouldn't prevent anyone else from merging on, so it would be non-rival. Okay? So the same good, characteristics that change of it, will change the type of good it is. So if I wanted a public good, I want non-rival, non-excludable. Easiest one, non-excludable, I don't have to pay for it, so that would be a, what road don't I have to pay to use? Non-toll road. It has to be non-rival, so that would be a road that is uncongested. Okay? So uncongested non-toll road would be our public good. What about a common resource? Same good, it's a road, but a common resource, it has to be non-excludable, so it's still going to be a non-toll road, but now it's rival, so it would be congested or heavy traffic, preventing other people from using it. So a congested non-toll road would be our common resource. And then if I want a private good, it's now both excludable and rival. So if it's excludable, that would be a toll road, a road I have to pay to use. And if it's rival, it would be a road that is so backed up I can't get on, so it would be congested. So a congested toll road, same good, it's a road, but the traits that changed about it make it now a private good. And then the only other one we have, natural monopoly, we said was non-rival but excludable. So if I have to pay for it, it's a toll road. Non-rival, it would be uncongested or not a lot of traffic. Okay? So the same good, characteristics changing, can change the type of good that it is. And we care about that because specifically we'll focus on common resources and public goods. Externalities might exist with those two types of goods. Okay? The other example I'll sometimes use, like if you're in class, do you have to, like, technically, I guess, to be in here, you should be paying to go to IU. So technically, attending my lecture is excludable, but there's more seats than there are students. So you coming here and listening to the lecture, does it prevent anybody else from coming in and listening? So it would be non-rival. So if it's excludable but non-rival, we would say that it's a, we go back to that unnatural monopoly, right? If you just think anyone technically can come sit in here, even if they're not an IU student, it would be non-excludable, non-rival, which would make it a public good. In fact, it's kind of a public good because I put these things on YouTube, and so anyone can really watch those, right? So if we think about public goods, what issue is going to exist, right? So I'll walk through an easy example and then kind of make it a more, broader market kind of context. But let's say I said it's a law example. I'm thinking about hiring police officers, right? Let's say I have one individual in the society, and the marginal benefit from having a police officer to him is as follows. If the price of a police officer, maybe this is like an hourly wage rate or it's in thousands, I don't know. How many police officers, if the price was 35, would Tom decide to hire? Well, the first one is the marginal benefit greater than the marginal cost. So would he hire that first police officer? Yes. What about the second? Yes. What about the third? So he would choose to hire two. Why would that not be the socially efficient quantity? If there's people other than Tom, once he hires a police officer, everybody else in that society is now going to get, is a police officer non-excludable? Once they're hired, the fact, like, you didn't hire the police officers that walk around here, but do you enjoy the benefit that they're around? Yes, right? In fact, some could argue that the city isn't choosing the optimal amount for society of police officers, right? So if I have other people in society, how would we want to actually make the decision? Well, Tom is hiring these police officers, but what's the total benefit to society? I did a simple two-person society here, but so I threw in Jill. What's the total marginal benefit of the first police officer? 80. So if I was making the decision for society, would I hire the first officer at the same price of 35? Yes. Second officer, 65 is greater than 35? Yes. Third, 50 is greater than 35? Yes. What about the fourth? Well, we always buy something or choose that it would be optimal if it's greater than or equal to. So will we hire that fourth officer for society? Yes. What about the fifth? No. So society, the optimal number of police officers here would be 4. So would Jill hire any on her own? Well, even the first officer, 30 is left. No. Tom would hire 2. So if we allow the individuals to make the decision, only 2 officers are going to get hired. We know the efficient point for society is 4. If the quantity is too low that the market chooses, this looks like a what? What underproduced relative to where society wanted it? This is when we had positive externalities, okay? So the fact that this is a non-excludable good creates positive externalities because once that good is out there, once national defense is out there, everybody gets to enjoy the marginal benefit of it, right? So there's these huge positive externalities, okay? So we can kind of think about what public policy can we use for public goods, and then eventually we'll talk about common resources. Well, with public goods, I just kind of talked through, we end up with a quantity that's too low, right? Another way of thinking about this before I model it for us is, let's think about a public good in the context of your lives, right? So if you're in class and you have a question, the marginal benefit of you getting it answered, maybe there's this cost that you don't want to look dumb in front of everybody else, right? So if that cost is relatively high, individually, what do most of you not do? Ask the question. So the private outcome is that how many questions do I maybe get, even though there's a misunderstanding? 0, because what do you hope? You hope that if I don't ask a question, if somebody else does, what's the cost to me? Well, I didn't have to look dumb in front of everyone, but what's the benefit? I get to hear the question answered. So if I don't ask it and someone else does, my marginal benefit is high, my cost is 0. So everybody doesn't ask the question, they rely on somebody else. But if all of us think that way, how many questions get asked? 0. So we call this the free rider problem, right? I hope, right, if this good is non-excludable, I just hope that I don't have to bear the cost. Somebody else will pay for this good. Somebody else will look dumb in front of class, which you never look dumb. Like, this is the first time you're hearing all these topics, so like ask questions, right? But the idea is this is the same thing. I always want to rely on someone else to provide it, but if we all have that same incentive, nobody provides the good, we don't get any of it, there's a free rider problem, okay? So the fact that we have this non-excludable characteristic, it causes this free rider problem, which essentially can also be modeled in the fact that there are positive externalities, that once this public good is out there, I can't prevent others from enjoying the marginal benefit of it. So in the most extreme example, and I sometimes will think about this in the context of like national defense, what's true if you specifically had your own demand curve in here, how much would you be willing to pay for national defense? Probably like it benefits you, but like probably a pretty low amount individually, right? Now, what's the cost of national defense? Insanely high, right? So where would supply and demand intersect here? At a negative value. So how much, if we allowed each individual to decide how much national defense, maybe Elon Musk or somebody would pay for a little bit of it, but most citizens are going to decide by how many units of national defense? 0, right? However, if someone else pays for it, what is the marginal benefit to society? Well, once national defense is out there, I would have to take your marginal benefit, your marginal benefit, your marginal, add them all up. So the positive externality that exists to society is going to be really large from something like national defense. So where is the efficient point? So here was what our market stopped at. Where would society want the quantity to be? Much higher, right? So with public goods, this free rider problem, because there's positive externalities that once this good is out there, it's non-excludable, we actually end up with too much or too little of a public good. Well, if the market is at a quantity of 0, for some of them, it definitely has to be too low, right? We want there to be more, or the efficient point for society is going to be much higher because there's positive externalities that exist. And it doesn't have to be this extreme. Like it could just be, you know, there could be some, like maybe the demand curve is here and there's some positive externality society, but I'm using the extreme to kind of make the point. that with these public goods, you can get 0 of them, when in fact the efficient point for society should be much higher. It's because there's positive externalities. So what can we do? I could subsidize these markets, right? Now it gets to be kind of weird. So like the government technically subsidizes a market for national defense. They pay for it, right? But they're paying themselves. How do they generate money to pay for that subsidy? They tax other goods. So now we have a more holistic view of it. It gets more complicated. I start to tax other markets, alcohol, tobacco, things like that, generate some tax revenue there. Yes, I'm creating deadweight loss in those markets, but if that deadweight loss is relatively small and the positive externalities to these public goods is really large, society is technically better off, right? Now that's not something that's throwing together multiple concepts into one. We won't dive into it that deep, but that's I want to connect the dots between what happens in the real world and what we're talking about with these models. Okay. Where are we at on time here? Oh, okay, perfect. So public goods have these positive externalities, so we know that we're going to get too little of them. Some other examples like knowledge created through scientific research, or another one that sometimes I hear people talking about around here right now. When there's like, when I walk around campus and I see like these beautiful sculptures, or like you're in some of these rooms and there's these paintings, right? Those paintings and people coming up with these things are relatively costly. So a lot of times we like to subsidize the arts, because if we don't, we get a quantity that is too low for society. But having these artistic kind of goods out there provides positive externalities to everybody walking around campus. And so what do? We subsidize those markets. We subsidize the art department, things like that. Okay. But try to grab like a good that makes sense for you in terms of a public good, whether that's national defense, firefighters, police officers. You could even think about, if you want, lectures being a public good in terms of it's non-excludable and non-rival, since I put them out on YouTube, whatever it is, right? So we kind of already talked a little bit about this, but like it's a more difficult kind of discussion. Once I'm looking at a public good, is the benefit to society, right? I know I want more of it. I've got to subsidize that market. That subsidy costs the government money. It has to come from somewhere, right? So I've got to tax other markets in order to pay for that subsidy, okay? So that kind of cost-benefit analysis gets a little bit more difficult, kind of outside the scope of what we'll talk about in this class, okay? All right, so I already kind of drew this out for us here, so that's why there's a blank slide. The next thing we'll talk about are common resources, okay? So we said common resources, and this is, once again, find a good that anchors your idea of what a common resource is. I always think about like fish in a pond, but this could be like, I'll have an example later of like publicly like available grazing land out west for cattle. But if we think about a common resource, it is non-excludable. People don't pay for it, but once you use it, there's less of it available for other people to use, right? So if you think about my office hours, when they're busy, are they excludable or non-excludable? I always tell, do you have to pay a fee to walk into those of you who have been there? No, right? It's non-excludable. But if you were there after the exam and it's relatively busy, you using part of my office hours prevents what? Possibly other people, right? So I have this non-excludable but rival good. That would be a common resource. What happens if it's non-excludable? People don't have to pay for it, but it is rival. People will overuse it, right? So, not that you can ever overuse my office hours. I don't want to say that, but like in terms of like a pond, if people go to fish that pond, once I catch a fish, what can that population not do as well? Repopulate, right? So if everybody starts to there's no cost to fishing in this pond, and we all don't care that they can't repopulate, what happens down the road? If we all go fish the same pond, potentially tomorrow there are no fish. What have I created now for society? Negative externality, right? So with common resources, right, we get the overuse of this good. So the market, if it's at a quantity that's too high, we would say what exists? A negative externality. So with public goods, we have positive externalities. Common resource, we have negative externalities that exist, okay? So I've already kind of given some examples here. But like this idea that people overuse a good because I don't care that the fish population can't repopulate, right? A really good example of this was bluefin tuna, and I forget what decade. This might have been like the 90s. All these companies were going out and like they were they don't care that the tuna population couldn't repopulate, so they go out and catch a bunch of fish, sell them, make a bunch of profit. But then the following year, how many fish are available relative to the year before? Well, if all these companies have the same incentive, they overfish the ocean. There's now fewer tuna the next year. There's less tuna available for everyone. So I've created now a negative externality to society down the road. Okay? So the overuse of this good creates this negative externality. Same kind of idea being like, there's this publicly available grazing land out west. It's like free. You can walk your cattle over to it. But if I walk my cattle over, they graze in the land, we go away. But another, farmer does the same thing, right? We don't have to pay to use this. What ends up happening to that patch of land? If we're all using it, all of our cattle are grazing on it, eventually it becomes dirt, right? And there's no longer anything available. The quantity now for society would be at 0, right? So I'm causing this huge negative externality by the overuse or this tragedy of the commons, that there's no price associated with using this common resource, and so we all kind of overuse it. Okay? Well, what would this look like if we've got negative externalities, right? I can think about this as, for a common resource, where would the market be at? Simply where supply is equal to demand. So here's that market quantity. Here's that market price, okay? If I have negative externalities that exist, right, how do we say we model those? Through it's an additional cost, so the supply curve. So at every point, there's a higher cost, right? If there's no positive externalities that exist, the private marginal benefits are the same as the social benefits. So where's the efficient quantity for society for these common resources where negative externalities exist? Where marginal social cost is equal to marginal social benefit. So for common resources, we actually want people to use less than what the market currently is, right? So if I want to incentivize there to be less, right, what do I have to do? Tax something, right? Now, essentially, what is a tax? If this was previously a common resource and I could use this for free, well, now when I tax it, I've caused the common resource to now become what? Well, it was rival, but now when I have to pay to use it, it has excludable, so it now becomes a private good, right? So forcing this common resource to become a private good can help get us to that socially efficient quantity, okay? So when we use taxes, we can really think about what are we doing? We're converting that from a non-excludable to an excludable good, okay? In the context of these common resources, okay? Any questions on this idea? So you'll notice we're really focusing heavily on quantities, okay? Now, the reason why I tell you to model this through the supply curve is because if I ever ask you about socially efficient prices, where would the socially efficient price be for this good? Relative to the market, it would actually be a little bit higher, right? This is the idea if I have these common resources, they're free to use, what would technically be a more efficient price for society instead of 0, the socially efficient price would actually be a little bit higher to disincentivize the use of this good. Okay. Any other questions here? Don't fall victim to the kind of free rider problem here. All right. So, all right, perfect. I want to work through the quiz questions here, and we'll kind of do this at the end. I want to show this to you, but I don't want anyone, don't write this down. I mean, you can, but I said that I only want you to model positive and negative externalities in one way. I just want to provide you some evidence or proof that it doesn't matter. You can, if you look at outside resources, you can model it a different way and get similar impacts. It's just a little bit less interpretable and a little bit more complicated. okay? So I modeled everything through the supply curve with negative externalities, and we saw that I was getting a quantity that was too high relative to where society wanted it. If I instead think about an additional cost, if I think about the benefits to society, if I model it through the demand curve, what's happened to society's benefits if there's a negative externality? They're actually now lower. So I could look at my old demand curve, private marginal benefits, and instead of modeling negative externalities through the supply curve, I could model it through the demand curve, but that would actually be the social benefit is now lower, right? So you'll notice here my marginal social benefit still showing a negative externality. If I model it through the demand curve, well, now where is the socially efficient point for society? It's going to be down here, where the market, where supply was equal to demand, or the private marginal cost were equal to the private marginal benefits, is up here. I get the exact same implication, which is that the market is actually overproducing goods that have negative externalities. Now, the difference comes if I'm trying to identify kind of that socially efficient price, that can look different depending on how I model it. So when I'm asking you about socially efficient prices, I'm only modeling negative externalities through the supply curve. So scratch this. And we're only modeling positive externalities through that demand curve. Okay. Now, there are other ways of modeling it, but it becomes less interpretable when I start to think about what deadweight loss is, because now I got like the underproduction, but like I'm seeing that there's like it's harder to kind of think about what deadweight loss really represents. And when I was telling you the deadweight loss triangle was always like the number of units we underproduced times the difference in the external, there it becomes a little bit less interpretable or less obvious. I think it's a little more complicated, which is why I only want you to focus on just modeling it one way for this class, okay? But you can model another way. And I also wanted to use this because I stole this from a textbook, but I like this because I'm only ever going to give you guys linear shifts when we're talking about external costs and benefits or negative and positive externalities. Always draw them as like it's the same per unit. In practice, that doesn't have to be the case. In fact, notice here, if I think about like my common resource example, it probably, to be really honest, the realistic way to model it is not a linear shift. Because if I think about an example like fish, these boats fishing the ocean, or I could use a pond, someone goes and catches one fish. Well, okay, there's one fewer fish. What's their, repopulation rate? It's going to go a little bit down, but not a whole lot. But what if there's 4 or 5 people now catching fish? Well, 4 or 5, now the repopulation of those fish becomes even lower. Well, what if there's 100 people? Even lower. So the value of the negative externality could actually depend on how much of that common resource is being used, which means the gap in between that demand curve and the social benefit, or the gap in between the old cost and the new social cost, could be getting greater and greater. So in this case, notice as more boats are on the ocean, that negative externality is actually getting larger and larger, representing that it's becoming harder and harder for the fish population to repopulate. Now, I'm never going to give you examples like this. This complicates the math. It doesn't really change any of like the directional changes we see. We're always just looking at linear shifts, okay? But I think given that we had a little bit of time, it's worth mentioning here and worth kind of seeing kind of what the next level is. I sometimes like to show like what the next level would be if you kind of took the next level of microeconomics. We'd start to dive into issues like this, right? Not keeping everything nice and linear. I'm not going to ask you questions on the exam or quiz about this. This is we had additional time. So we're going to kind of scratch on this. When we think about efficient use, we've really already talked about this. If a common resource has a negative externality, we said we can tax it or we can use quotas. We see this with common resources a lot, right? Like for deer, can you go out and actually legally hunt and kill 12 deer this year? No. In fact, the DNR will, you're going to be screwed, right? What is it in Indiana? Do you get 1 buck and 2 does now? Does anybody know? Is it the higher? Okay. When I was younger in Michigan, it was like they had it limited by quite a bit. I think it was 1 buck and like 2 doe a year, but I know that they've increased a little bit in certain states, right? But what is that essentially doing? It's creating a quota, right? So they don't tax the market for hunting deer, but they put a quota on how many you can shoot and kill. Same kind of idea technically with fish, like you're only supposed to catch a certain amount in different lakes or ponds, things like that. Okay? So quotas, taxes, help us resolve that negative externality issue, which we know exists for common resources, right? And then I kind of worked through this with the in-class quizzes. We've actually already talked about with negative externalities, I can just tax it. It looks the exact same as what we did earlier in class. Okay? These are kind of just summary slides if you want to go back and review them, just to kind of give you some like more examples, although I think I've mentioned almost all of these. But what I want to focus on for the end of class here is publishing this quiz. So this should show up under the home tab or under the quiz tab now, in-class quiz 7.2. And today's magic number is 20.17, right? So 20.17 will get you into that quiz. I said this is how we're going to do things kind of moving forward because too many people were taking advantage of the fact that I didn't have these kind of set up, right? So 20.17, everybody, is that number getting you into the quiz? We're working. Any Wi-Fi issues? So we've got about 10 minutes. Last class, they kind of all resolve themselves in a few minutes. So as we start kind of discussing these, just have it kind of set so that it's loading, and then we'll hopefully be able to get them uploaded and answered before the end of class today at 12:25. Okay? All right. So if we think about public good examples, we said with a public good, and this is not a technical way of remembering it, but this is maybe how I would remember it. Public goods have what type of externalities? Public goods start with a P. What type of externalities do public goods have? Positive externalities. That's a good, easy way to remember it. So positive externalities we have existing with public goods. So what's going to happen? What's true about the market quantity relative to the socially efficient point? And what can we use to correct this? Right? So when we had a public good, so I've got supply and demand. This is how I would always start out drawing positive and negative externalities. Let's just figure out where the market is first. The market is simply where supply is equal to demand. Okay? Now, where would the society want this quantity to be, or where is the socially efficient point? Well, if I have a public good, we said there's a positive externality. So I'm going to model that through what? Positive externality is an external or additional benefit. So we're going to model that through our demand curve. At every point with a positive externality, the benefit to society is whatever the benefit to the consumer was, plus that per unit value of the positive externality, or plus the external benefit. Okay? So if we don't have any negative externalities, the private marginal cost or society's marginal cost, where's the efficient point for society? Where society's marginal costs are equal to society's marginal benefits. That would be out here. So society's quantity or allocated efficient quantity and the kind of resulting socially efficient, we want to call it price, would be up here. Right? So for society, the quantity should be higher, which means the market is actually at a quantity that is too low, or they are underproducing. Right? The fact that they're underproducing means that every unit in this range, there was positive surplus to society, right? Total surplus to society is the difference between the marginal social benefits and the marginal social costs. Every unit here we're no longer seeing on the market had positive externality that we're no longer seeing, right? So this is all going to be our deadweight loss to society. We want to be real specific. It's not to the market, it's to society. So how can I get there to be more of something? We said we can give subsidies. The perfect value of that subsidy would be if I set it equal to what? The value of the external benefit. Then I would be getting my demand curve to be exactly equal to society's marginal benefits, or we said we can think about this as society's demand curve. Okay? So there we had the market quantity was too low, and how can I resolve this positive externality issue? I can give subsidies. Okay? So too low and subsidies was our answer there. Okay? Any questions over anything here? Okay? All right. So the next question, we've instead got a common resource, okay? So if I've got a common resource, right, where is the market going to choose to be? Well, actually, the first question is actually just asking me, kind of getting at some of the things we talked about today. A common resource, we said, so anchor it to an example that makes sense for you. If this is fish in the ocean, we said I can go fish and it's free. This would be a good that is non-excludable. But me using it, there's now less for people to kind of go out and catch. So it would be rival. So we had a rival non-excludable good. I think the only options then for the first one that makes sense would be non-excludable, right? Because it's rival, it's not non-rival. Now, if we're thinking about the socially efficient price relative to the market price, once again, negative or positive externalities, just start out drawing where would the market be without any externality, right? Or like, where's the market going to choose to be? Right here, right? Now, if we've got negative externalities that exist with common resources, so once again, public good, positive externality. Negative good, negative good. Public good, positive externality. Common resource, negative externality. So if I have a negative externality, I model that through my supply curve. At every point, the costs of society are now higher, right? So my marginal social cost would be up here. If I have no positive externalities, I'd have this, right? My social benefits are the same as the private marginal benefits. So the market is going to be at a quantity that is too high relative to the society's optimal point. But the price of the market is actually going to be what relative to where society wants it? The market is actually going to be at a price that is too low, right? Here, a higher socially efficient price is going to disincentivize the use of this, whereas with a positive externality, notice the socially optimal price in both models should always be higher, right? Now, I think the way the question is worded, it says what's true about the market price. So here, the market price was actually too low or less than the socially efficient price, okay? So this should be the only two ways in which we are modeling negative externalities, which exist for these common resources. And over here we had, this is the way that we want to be modeling positive externalities, which we saw for public goods, okay? Any questions over anything there? Okay? So make sure you're getting that quiz submitted, right? We kind of talked through what those answers were. We had what? Too low and a subsidy. We then had non-excludable, and the market price was actually less than the socially efficient price. So that closes out here in the next 2 minutes. So before I let you get out of here, right, you'll see the next Module 8 reading, Module 7 quiz pop up after class today. Those are both due at the end of the day on Monday. You'll also see that additional video in which I'll work through a negative externality example with some kind of different visuals, as well as some numbers that kind of help, I think, solve through or reason through why those models look the way they do when we're talking about surplus. So look for that on YouTube as well. Otherwise, have a fun, safe fall break, and I will see you guys on Tuesday.